On Mother's Day, my son set a bouquet down on my kitchen table, looked at me with that gentle, distracted warmth he always has now and said, "Mom, Renata's still sending you the $3,200 every month, right? I just want to make sure you're comfortable." I froze with my hands still on the tea kettle. $3,200? For 12 straight months, I had been rationing canned vegetables from my church's food pantry, wearing the same winter coat I'd owned for 9 years, and telling myself my son was simply too busy building his company to visit more than twice a year. His wife, sitting right beside him at my own kitchen table, didn't even blink. She reached over, patted my hand gently and said, "Preston, sweetheart, I think Mom's just getting a little forgetful lately." I had balanced payroll for a Fortune 500 company for 40 years without a single decimal point out of place. I had never forgotten a number in my life. I'm so grateful you're here with me today. Before we go any further, where are you watching from and how did you find this channel? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one and it genuinely means the world to me. If this story resonates with you, hit subscribe and share it with someone who might need to hear it. My name is Constance Marsh. I'm 69 years old, a widow, and for 40 years I built a career on catching other people's mistakes before they cost anyone a single dollar. I never once imagined I'd need those same skills to catch my own daughter-in-law stealing from me, or that my own son would sit across from me, flowers in hand, having no idea his wife had spent an entire year making sure I never saw a cent of the money he believed he was sending. I didn't argue with either of them that day. I smiled, thanked my son for the flowers and said nothing at all. That night I opened a leather ledger I hadn't touched since retirement, and I started writing everything down. I didn't sleep much that Mother's Day night, and by 6 the next morning I was already in the car, driving to the only bank branch in town that still let you speak to an actual person instead of a machine. I want to explain something about myself before I tell you what I found there, because I think it matters to understanding why I didn't simply accept Renata's explanation at face value the way I suspect she fully expected me to. I spent 40 years as a payroll clerk and staff accountant for a regional manufacturing company outside Tulsa, the kind of career where a single misplaced decimal point could mean an employee's mortgage payment bouncing, or a vendor going unpaid for a month through nobody's fault but a careless keystroke. I learned, over 4 decades in that work, to trust documentation completely and instinct only as a starting point for finding the documentation that would either confirm or dismantle it. My memory has never been the problem in this family. My memory is, if anything, the one thing about me that has never once failed. The branch manager, a patient young woman named Priya who'd helped me open a certificate of deposit some years back after Harold passed, pulled my full account history without hesitation once I explained I simply wanted to review the past year. I sat across from her desk with my hands folded in my lap, watching the printer hum quietly beside her, and felt something cold and steady settle into my chest as the pages came out. Not disbelief exactly, because some quiet part of me had already suspected what I was about to find, but something closer to confirmation arriving right on schedule, the way a suspected error always eventually shows up plainly once you actually go looking for it. 12 months of statements. Not one deposit beyond my regular Social Security payment and the small modest interest my CD generated twice a year. No $3,200. No transfer of any kind from Preston or from Renata or from anyone at all. "Everything all right, Mrs. Marsh?" Priya asked, watching my face as I turned through the pages a second time, checking dates twice the way I once double-checked every payroll run before it went out the door. "I'm not entirely sure yet," I told her honestly, "but I think I'm about to find out." I drove home that morning with the printed statements sitting on the passenger seat beside me, and I want to be honest about the particular quality of grief that settled over me during that drive, because it wasn't only anger, though anger was certainly part of it. It was the specific disorienting grief of realizing that an entire year of my life, a year I had spent quietly rationing canned goods, wearing a coat with a torn lining I'd meant to replace, telling neighbors I simply preferred a modest life rather than admitting how tight things had actually become, had been built on top of a lie I hadn't even known enough to question. I thought about Doris next door, who'd started leaving extra tomatoes and squash from her garden on my back step some weeks without ever making a show of it. The particular quiet kindness of a woman who'd noticed more about my situation than my own son apparently had. I thought about Pastor Whitfield at First Baptist, who'd never once asked why I'd started showing up at the Thursday food pantry distribution, simply handing me my bag of canned goods with the same warm, unremarkable greeting he gave everyone else in line, protecting whatever dignity I had left without ever naming what he clearly understood I was going through. And I thought about Preston standing in my kitchen the day before with that bouquet of flowers, asking so gently whether I was comfortable, genuinely believing, I understood now with total clarity, that he had been taking care of his mother for an entire year. My son hadn't lied to me at that table. That understanding arrived slowly over the course of that drive home, and it mattered enormously to what I decided to do next. Preston believed what he'd said. Someone else had made very certain he'd believe it. I got home a little before 9, made myself a cup of tea I barely touched, and went up to the small closet in my bedroom where I kept the few boxes I hadn't unpacked since Harold and I downsized into this house 11 years earlier. It took me nearly 20 minutes of careful searching before I found it, tucked beneath a stack of old photograph albums. A brown leather ledger, the same kind I'd used for 30 years of professional bookkeeping before retirement, its pages still mostly blank, purchased new the year I retired with some vague sentimental idea that I might use it for personal record keeping and never quite had a reason to. I sat down at my own kitchen table. The same table where Preston had stood with his flowers less than 20 hours earlier, and I opened that ledger to its first blank page. I wrote the date at the top, careful and precise, the same way I'd headed every payroll ledger of my career. Beneath it, I began writing down everything I could remember. Every visit from Renata over the past year, every gift, every comment about money or the transfers or my comfort, every small detail I could recall with enough specificity to matter later. I didn't yet know exactly what I was building toward. I only knew, closing that ledger an hour later, that I was no longer simply a woman quietly enduring a difficult year. I was, for the first time since Harold died, keeping score again, the way I'd been trained to for 40 years, precise and patient and entirely unwilling to let a single figure go unverified. Renata visited the following Saturday, unannounced the way she often did, pulling into my driveway in a vehicle I didn't immediately recognize as hers, a gleaming white Range Rover, still bearing temporary dealer tags in the rear window, parked with the particular careless confidence of someone accustomed to taking up exactly as much space as she pleased. "Isn't she gorgeous?" Renata said, climbing out and gesturing back at the SUV with obvious pride before she'd even greeted me properly. "Preston surprised me with her last week. I told him it was far too much, but you know how generous he's become since the company really took off." I stood in my own doorway, my leather ledger sitting open on the kitchen table behind me where I'd left it that morning, and I found myself, for the first time in longer than I could remember, studying my daughter-in-law with the same careful, unhurried attention I once gave a payroll discrepancy that didn't quite balance. "It's a beautiful vehicle," I told her, which was true, and which cost me nothing to say honestly while I quietly calculated, without letting my expression change at all, what a vehicle like that likely ran a person new off the lot. I'd priced comparable models for a neighbor's son the previous year, helping him understand financing terms he hadn't fully grasped, and I remembered the number clearly enough to feel it settle uncomfortably alongside everything else I now understood about the past 12 months. She came inside carrying a small gift bag, the kind with elaborate tissue paper spilling artfully over the top that suggested considerably more thought than the contents usually justified, and handed it to me with a warm, practiced smile. Inside sat a scented candle, the kind sold at a boutique shop downtown for considerably more than its actual worth, and a card that read in Renata's looping handwriting, "Happy belated Mother's Day from both of us." "Thank you," I said, setting it carefully on the counter. "That's very thoughtful." We sat together at my kitchen table for the better part of an hour, Renata chattering easily about a spa weekend she'd just returned from, a new handbag she'd been eyeing, a renovation she and Preston were considering for their kitchen. I listened more carefully than I let on, noting each detail without comment, understanding now that every small extravagance she mentioned so casually sat somewhere on a ledger of its own, one I intended to eventually see in full. It was near the end of that visit, while Renata was gathering her purse to leave, that the first genuinely useful slip happened. Small, easily missed if I hadn't already been listening as closely as I was. A receipt fell from the side pocket of her purse as she stood, fluttering to the floor near my chair, and Renata bent quickly to retrieve it, though not quite quickly enough. I'd seen enough of the paper in the brief moment before she scooped it up, to catch the header clearly. Hayes Technology Solutions, Preston's company, printed across the top of what was unmistakably a corporate credit card statement, a line item beneath it reading something about a spa treatment I hadn't caught the full figure on, but which had clearly not been a modest one. "Butterfingers today," Renata said lightly, tucking the paper away before I could ask a single question about it, and I said nothing, filing the detail away carefully alongside everything else I intended to examine more closely once I understood exactly what I was looking for. She mentioned, almost as an afterthought on her way out the door, something that struck me considerably harder than the receipt had. "Oh, and Mom, I left a little something extra in an envelope for you in case you need it before the next transfer goes through. It's in the car, hold on, let me grab it." I stood on my own porch watching her walk back to that gleaming white Range Rover, retrieve a small envelope from the glove compartment, and hand it to me with the same warm, practiced smile she'd greeted me with an hour earlier. I opened it once she'd finally driven away, my hands steadier than I expected them to be. $200 in cash, folded neatly inside a plain white envelope. I sat with that envelope at my kitchen table for a long while afterward, turning it over slowly, understanding with total clarity exactly what I was looking at. $200. Offered casually as a small gesture of extra generosity, against a supposed monthly transfer of $3,200 that had never once actually arrived. I thought about the mention of "before the next transfer goes through," language so specific and confident that I understood, hearing it repeated in my memory, that Renata had clearly used some version of that exact phrase with Preston as well, often enough that it had become an easy, automatic thing to say. I opened my ledger that evening and wrote everything down. The Range Rover, the spa receipt glimpsed and quickly hidden, the $200 in cash offered as though it were generosity rather than what I now suspected it actually was. A small, calculated gesture meant to keep me quiet and grateful, just enough to prevent me from ever asking the kind of direct questions that might unravel something considerably larger. I didn't yet have proof of anything beyond my own careful observations. But I understood, closing that ledger for the second time that week, that I was no longer simply documenting confusion or forgetfulness on anyone's part. I was documenting a pattern, the same way I'd once documented a pattern of vendor overcharges that eventually exposed an entire fraudulent billing scheme at the company I'd worked for decades earlier. I needed someone inside Preston's own company who could tell me, plainly and with real authority, exactly what those corporate card statements actually showed. I thought, sitting there that evening, of a name Preston had mentioned more than once over the years with genuine respect and fondness. A man named Walter Denny, the chief accountant at Hayes Technology Solutions, someone Preston had once described as the only person at that company who catches every single thing, no matter how small. I found his office number the next morning and I called it before I could talk myself out of it. Walter Denny agreed to meet me the following Tuesday at a coffee shop several blocks from Preston's office rather than the office itself, a choice I understood immediately as deliberate once I arrived and found him already seated at a corner table, angled slightly away from the door in a way that suggested a man accustomed to conversations he preferred not to have observed. He was perhaps 60, silver-haired, with the particular unhurried carefulness I recognized instantly from my own decades in the profession. The bearing of someone who had spent a career finding the one number that didn't belong among 10,000 that did. He stood when I approached, shook my hand properly, and waited until I'd settled into my chair before he spoke. "Mrs. Marsh," he said, "Preston speaks about you often and always warmly. I have to say I was surprised to hear from you directly rather than through him." "I imagine you were," I said, and I found myself sitting across from this careful stranger, deciding quickly that the most efficient path forward was simply honesty, the same instinct that had served me well through 4 decades of untangling other people's financial messes. "I'll tell you plainly why I called. I have reason to believe my daughter-in-law has been telling my son she sends me money each month that I've never received. I'd like to understand whether there's any way to determine through the company whether corporate funds might somehow be connected to what I'm describing." Walter was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on its saucer, and I watched something shift behind his careful, professional expression. Not quite surprise, I understood later, but something closer to a suspicion of his own finally finding a place to land. "I'm going to be honest with you, Mrs. Marsh, in a way I probably shouldn't be, given that you're not technically my employer or anyone I have any obligation to disclose company matters to," he said carefully. "But I've had some concerns of my own over the past year that I haven't yet raised directly with Preston, because I didn't have anything concrete enough to bring to him, only a pattern of expenses that felt larger and less well documented than I'd expect." "What kind of expenses?" I asked. "Renata has authorized use of a company card," he said, "which isn't unusual on its own. Plenty of founders extend that courtesy to a spouse for legitimate business entertaining, client dinners, that sort of thing. What's unusual is the volume and the categories I've been seeing over the past year. Spa services. Retail purchases at boutiques that have nothing to do with client relations. A vehicle lease that got coded, somewhat creatively, as a company transportation asset, though as far as I can tell, no one at Hayes Technology Solutions besides Renata has ever driven it." He paused, choosing his next words with obvious care. "I've flagged some of this internally, quietly, through routine expense review processes, but Preston's been extremely hands-off about anything touching Renata's spending. I think he trusts her completely, and I haven't wanted to be the person who plants the first seed of doubt without solid ground to stand on." I told him everything then. The Mother's Day conversation, the empty bank statements I'd already confirmed myself, the Range Rover, the $200 offered so casually against a supposed $3,200 monthly transfer. Walter listened without interrupting, the particular stillness of a man absorbing information he'd clearly half suspected but hadn't wanted to fully believe. "I want to be careful here," he said once I'd finished. "What you're describing, if it's accurate, goes considerably beyond questionable expense categories. If your daughter-in-law has been telling Preston she's transferring money to you and that money has never actually left the company or their personal accounts in your direction, that's not simply overspending. That could be outright theft, potentially fraud, depending on exactly how the funds were represented and where they actually went." "Can you find out," I asked him, "whether the money exists somewhere? Whether it's simply sitting in an account I don't know about, or whether it's gone somewhere else entirely?" Walter sat with that question for a long moment, and I understood watching him that I was asking him to cross a line he hadn't yet crossed in the quiet unease he'd apparently been carrying for months on his own. "I can look at the company side records without difficulty," he finally said. "Anything touching corporate accounts, corporate cards, that's well within my ordinary responsibilities as chief accountant. What I can't do easily is access Preston's or Renata's personal banking directly, not without raising questions I'm not yet prepared to raise before I understand the full picture myself." "I don't need you to access anything that isn't already yours to see," I told him. "I only need to understand what the company's records actually show. I can handle the rest myself." He nodded slowly, and something in his expression settled into a quiet, deliberate resolve I recognized completely, the exact expression I imagine I'd worn myself decades earlier, the first time I'd caught a pattern of fraud significant enough that ignoring it was no longer an option I could live with. "Give me 2 weeks," he said. I want to be thorough, Mrs. Marsh, because if this is what it looks like, I intend to have something complete enough that no one can argue it away as a misunderstanding or a clerical error. I've seen that happen before in other situations. Someone raises a concern too early without enough documentation, and the whole thing gets quietly buried before it ever gets the scrutiny it deserves. 2 weeks, I agreed. And Mr. Denny, thank you. I understand this puts you in a difficult position with your employer. Preston's a good man, Walter said, gathering his coat to leave. I don't think he has any idea what's actually been happening here. If what you're describing turns out to be true, Mrs. Marsh, I think finding out is going to hurt him considerably more than it hurts anyone else involved, and I'd rather he hear it clearly with real proof than continue believing something that isn't true simply because no one was willing to show him otherwise. I drove home that afternoon with a strange, unfamiliar mixture of dread and relief settling over me in equal measure. Relief that I was no longer carrying this suspicion entirely alone, and dread, genuine and heavy, at exactly how much further this now seemed likely to go before it was finished. Walter called me 11 days later, sooner than the 2 weeks he'd asked for, and something in his voice when I picked up the phone told me immediately that whatever he'd found had moved considerably faster than either of us expected, and considerably further than either of us had hoped. Mrs. Marsh, he said, I think you should come to my office this time, not a coffee shop. And I think you should bring someone with you if you have anyone you trust to sit in on this conversation. What I've found is going to be difficult to hear. I called Doris next door, who'd become, over the preceding weeks of careful investigation, one of the only people I'd confided in about any of this, and she agreed without hesitation to come with me, the same quiet, unshowy generosity she'd already been extending through tomatoes and squash left on my back step for months without my ever having to ask. Walter's office at Hayes Technology Solutions occupied a modest corner on the 3rd floor, considerably less flashy than I expected from a company I understood, from Preston's own occasional mentions, to be doing quite well for itself. He had a folder waiting for us on his desk when we arrived, thick enough that I felt my stomach tighten simply looking at its edges before he'd opened it at all. I want to walk you through this carefully, he said, because some of it is going to be hard to absorb all at once. He opened the folder and slid the first document across the desk toward me. This is the account Preston believes he's been funding for the past year. A standing monthly transfer of $3,200. Set up through the company's payroll system as a designated family support disbursement, which isn't unusual for a founder who wants to support a parent directly through payroll rather than personal accounts, for tax purposes. I studied the document carefully, recognizing the formatting instantly from my own decades of similar work. This shows the transfers going out, I said. Every month, exactly as Preston believed. It does, Walter agreed. The money left the company precisely on schedule, every single month for 12 consecutive months. The problem, Mrs. Marsh, is where it actually went. He slid a second document across the desk and I felt something cold settle deep in my chest as I read it. This is the receiving account information attached to those transfers. The account is titled in the name Constance R. Marsh. That's my name, I said, though something in his careful pause told me it wasn't quite that simple. It's very nearly your name, Walter said gently. Your legal name as it appears on your own accounts and your identification is Constance E. Marsh. Elizabeth, your middle name. This account was opened using the middle initial R, for a name the bank's own paperwork lists as Constance Renata Marsh. He let that settle for a moment before continuing. I made a call carefully to a contact I have at the bank where this account was opened, framing it as a routine internal audit inquiry rather than anything more pointed. The account was opened 14 months ago in person with a driver's license presented that the branch's own notes describe as belonging to a woman matching your general age and description. But Mrs. Marsh, I don't believe that was actually you. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling Doris's hand find mine on the arm of my chair, steady and grounding in a way I badly needed in that particular moment. You're telling me she opened an account in a version of my name, I said slowly, close enough to pass the bank's paperwork, and had someone else's identification, or perhaps some kind of forged version of mine, used to open it. That's precisely what the documentation suggests, Walter said. And Mrs. Marsh, I have to tell you the rest of it because I think you deserve to understand the full scope before we go any further. Every single one of the 12 monthly transfers Preston believed was going to support you was instead deposited directly into that account. $38,400 over the course of the past year, none of which ever reached you. I felt the number land somewhere heavier than simple anger, a particular grief settling in alongside it. Grief for the year I'd spent rationing canned goods and wearing a coat with a torn lining, believing I was simply managing frugally through ordinary circumstances, when in fact a fortune large enough to have solved every one of those quiet hardships had been sitting, the entire time, in an account bearing a fraudulent version of my own name. There's more, Walter said, and I understood from his tone that he genuinely wished there wasn't. He slid a third, thicker stack of documents across the desk. This is the corporate card activity I mentioned when we first spoke. Once I had reason to look more carefully, I traced back a full 18 months rather than just the past year. The total in charges that don't correspond to any legitimate business purpose I can identify comes to just under $46,000. Spa memberships. Designer retail purchases. The vehicle lease we discussed, coded as a company asset despite no business use I can locate anywhere in the records. A number of charges at restaurants and hotels on dates that don't align with any client meetings or business trips on Preston's own calendar. I looked through the pages slowly, my own trained eye moving efficiently through the categories and dates the way I once moved through payroll discrepancies, and I understood by the time I reached the last page, that I was looking at a pattern considerably larger and more deliberate than simple carelessness or minor overspending. This was methodical. This had been happening for well over a year, executed by someone who understood exactly how to keep individual transactions small enough and varied enough that no single item would draw scrutiny on its own. What do I do with this? I asked Walter quietly. I don't want to destroy my son's life or his company. But I can't simply pretend I never learned any of it either. Walter closed the folder gently and looked at me with genuine, careful compassion. I think, Mrs. Marsh, you need proper legal counsel before you do anything further. Someone who specializes specifically in elder financial exploitation, because that's precisely what this appears to be, regardless of the family relationship involved. And I think before any of that, you need to decide whether you want to give Renata a chance to reveal the truth herself in front of Preston, or whether you'd rather this evidence simply be presented to him directly all at once. I thought about that question the entire drive home, Doris quiet and steady beside me, and by the time we reached my own driveway, I understood exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted Renata to have one more chance to tell the truth herself, in front of witnesses who would know immediately if she didn't. I wanted to watch her lie one final time with everything already documented and waiting, before I ever showed her exactly how much I already knew. I called Preston myself the following week, my voice steady in a way I'd practiced carefully beforehand, and asked whether he and Renata might come for dinner that Sunday, mentioning only that I wanted to catch up properly, the kind of ordinary invitation I'd extended dozens of times over the years without either of them ever suspecting anything beneath it. I spent the days beforehand preparing more carefully than I let on to anyone but Doris, who'd offered gently to be nearby that evening in case I needed her, an offer I declined only because I understood this particular conversation needed to happen with just the three of us at the table, unwitnessed by anyone who might make Renata more guarded than usual. I made a roast, the same recipe I'd made for Preston's birthday every year since he was a boy, and I set the table with care, and when they arrived a little after 5, I greeted them both warmly, genuinely, understanding that whatever came next would land considerably harder if Renata had any reason to suspect the evening was anything other than ordinary. We talked easily through the first half of dinner, Preston telling me about a new client his company had landed, Renata mentioning with her usual bright enthusiasm a charity gala she'd been helping organize for the following month. I listened and nodded and waited for the right opening, the same patient, unhurried attention I'd once applied to a stack of financial records waiting to reveal exactly where their numbers stopped adding up. It was Preston himself, unknowingly, who gave me the opening I needed. "Mom, I meant to ask," he said, reaching for another helping of potatoes. "Did the transfer go through okay this month? Renata mentioned there was some kind of delay with the bank a few weeks back." I kept my voice light, curious rather than accusatory. "What kind of delay?" "Just a processing hiccup," Renata said smoothly, not missing a beat. I mentioned it to Preston. The transfer that usually goes out on the 15th got pushed back a few days this month, some kind of system update on the bank's end. It went through eventually, though. The 21st, I think it was. I felt something settle into place, cold and precise, the exact sensation I remembered from decades earlier. The first time a vendor's explanation for a billing discrepancy contradicted itself just slightly enough to confirm what I'd already begun to suspect. "The 21st, I repeated. "That's interesting. Because Priya at the bank pulled my full statement history for me just last week, going back a full year, and I don't see a transfer landing on the 21st of any month at all. In fact, I don't see a transfer landing on any date in any month for the entire year." The table went very quiet. Preston set his fork down slowly, his expression shifting from confusion into something more uncertain. "Wait, Mom, what do you mean you don't see it? Renata's shown me the transfer confirmations herself, more than once." "I'd be very interested to see those confirmations," I said, still calm, still deliberately unhurried, watching Renata's face carefully now the way I'd watch a number that refused to reconcile no matter how many times I ran the calculation. "Because my bank statements, which I have sitting right here in the next room if either of you would like to review them, show exactly $0 received from any source beyond my Social Security payment for the entire past 12 months. "That's not possible," Renata said, and I watched with a kind of clinical, exhausted clarity. Exactly the same phrase I imagine countless people in her position have reached for across countless similar conversations. "There must be some kind of bank error. Maybe the wrong account number got entered somewhere along the line." "That's certainly possible," I said, keeping my tone entirely reasonable, entirely open, giving her every opportunity to simply tell the truth in that exact moment, the way I genuinely hoped some quiet part of me she still might. "Perhaps the money's sitting in an account I don't know about, under some slightly different version of my name. Would you happen to know anything about that?" I watched something flicker across Renata's face in the half-second before she answered. A flash of calculation quickly smoothed back into practiced concern, and I understood, watching it, that she was genuinely considering in that moment exactly how much I actually knew versus how much she could still successfully talk her way around. "I have no idea what you're suggesting," she said, her voice sharpening slightly now, the warmth draining out of it in a way I don't think she fully realized was happening. "Preston, I don't understand why your mother is suddenly interrogating me over dinner like I'm some kind of criminal. I've been nothing but generous to her for a year." "Nobody's interrogating anyone," Preston said, though his voice carried a new, uncertain edge I hadn't heard from him in a very long time. The sound of a man beginning to sense for the first time that something beneath his own feet had shifted without his noticing. "Renata, can you just show me the transfer confirmations? Now on your phone? If they exist, this clears up in about 30 seconds. Renata's composure cracked, just slightly, just long enough for me to see it clearly before she smoothed it back over. "I don't have my phone set up to pull old records like that in front of everyone at the dinner table, Preston. This is ridiculous. Your mother is clearly confused about her own finances, and I think it's honestly a little concerning that she's making these kinds of accusations." There it was again, the same word, deployed exactly as I'd expected it might be, confused. The particular, calculated cruelty of suggesting an elderly woman's own carefully verified bank statements were less reliable than a story that had already contradicted itself twice within a single conversation. I didn't push further that evening. I'd learned what I needed to learn, watched exactly the reaction I'd expected, and confirmed with total certainty now that Renata was not going to volunteer the truth on her own, not even with Preston sitting directly beside her, growing visibly more unsettled by the second. "I think we should call it an early evening," I said gently, standing to begin clearing the table. "I don't want to spoil a nice dinner over what's probably just a simple mix-up somewhere." Renata looked visibly relieved at that, gathering her things a little too quickly, eager, I understood, to leave before the conversation could go any further. Preston lingered a moment longer at the door, looking back at me with an expression I hadn't seen from him in years, something between confusion and a dawning, reluctant suspicion he clearly wasn't ready to fully examine yet. "Mom," he said quietly, "if something's actually wrong here, I need you to tell me. Properly. Not tonight maybe, but soon." Soon, I promised him, and I meant it completely. I simply intended walking back into my own quiet kitchen once they'd finally driven away, to make absolutely certain that when I finally told him everything, I'd have proof substantial enough that no clever explanation about bank errors or confused old women could talk him back out of believing it. I called Walter the morning after that dinner, and within the same conversation he gave me the name of an attorney he trusted completely, a woman named Diane Kessler who'd built her entire practice around exactly this particular kind of case. Elder financial exploitation, often within families, the sort of quiet, devastating fraud that rarely made headlines but ruined lives with the same thoroughness as any more dramatic crime. Diane's office sat downtown, considerably more polished than Walter's modest corner desk, though she carried the same unhurried, careful competence I'd come to trust in him over the preceding weeks. She listened to my full account without interrupting once, taking notes in a small leather notebook not unlike my own, and when I finished she sat back in her chair and studied me for a long moment before she spoke. "Mrs. Marsh," she said, "I want to be direct with you about something important before we go any further. What you've described, and what Mr. Denny has already documented, isn't simply a family dispute over money. Under Oklahoma law, what you're describing meets the statutory definition of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and given the scale involved, this is very likely a matter for criminal prosecution alongside any civil action we pursue to recover what's owed to you." "I don't want Preston prosecuted for anything," I told her quickly. "He didn't do this. He believed he was helping me." "I understand that concern completely," Diane said, "and based on everything you've described, I agree your son appears to be a victim in this situation nearly as much as you are, simply in a different way. The exploitation statute concerns itself with Renata's conduct specifically: the forged account, the diverted transfers, the misuse of corporate funds. Preston's own liability, if any exists at all, would be an entirely separate question, and frankly, Mrs. Marsh, nothing in what you've told me suggests he did anything beyond trusting his wife more than the situation apparently warranted." Over the following 2 weeks, Diane and Walter worked together to compile a case file more thorough than anything I could have assembled entirely on my own, even with 40 years of accounting instinct guiding every question I'd already asked. Walter traced the corporate card activity back a full 18 months rather than simply the year I'd initially suspected, uncovering a pattern that had clearly begun modestly and grown steadily bolder over time, the particular escalation I recognized from my own career as the signature of someone who'd started small, tested how much scrutiny their spending actually attracted, and grown gradually more confident once none arrived. The final figures, once Diane laid them out for me in full, were considerably larger than even my own careful ledger had suggested. $38,400 diverted from the 12 months of payroll transfers meant for me, redirected entirely into the fraudulent account bearing a forged version of my name. $45,800 in unauthorized corporate card charges across 18 months, spa memberships, designer retail purchases at 3 separate boutiques, the Range Rover lease disguised as a company transportation asset, and most damning of all in Diane's assessment, Several charges at a private storage facility on the outskirts of Tulsa that neither Walter nor Preston had any record of authorizing or even knowing existed. "I want to understand what's in that storage unit," Diane said, reviewing that particular line item carefully. "Renting private storage isn't itself suspicious, but paying for it through a corporate card without any documented business purpose tells me there's something there Renata didn't want kept anywhere more visible." Diane filed a discreet motion the following week, part of the broader legal groundwork she was laying, to obtain access to the storage facility's rental records, and what came back 3 days later added a final, damning piece to a case that already felt to me thoroughly complete. The unit had been rented 14 months earlier. The same month, I noted with a cold, settling clarity that the fraudulent account bearing my forged name had first been opened. Its contents, according to the facility's own inventory conducted under the court order Diane secured, included several designer handbags still in their original packaging, boxes of unworn clothing with tags attached, and tucked toward the back, a small fireproof lockbox containing copies of documents that would ultimately prove more damaging to Renata than almost anything else in the entire case. "There's a notarized signature card in here," Diane told me once she'd reviewed the box's contents herself. "Used to open the fraudulent account in your name. And Mrs. Marsh, I had our office's forensic document examiner compare the signature against verified samples of your actual signature from your own bank records." She slid a photocopy across her desk toward me. "It's not a particularly sophisticated forgery. Someone practiced your signature, clearly, based on documents they'd likely seen around your house or through Preston at some point, but it doesn't match yours closely enough to survive expert scrutiny. This alone, Mrs. Marsh, is likely enough to support a forgery charge independent of the broader exploitation case." I sat with that photocopy in my hands for a long while, studying the careful, practiced approximation of my own signature, understanding with a clarity that still, even now, catches somewhere painful in my chest exactly how deliberately and how far in advance all of this had been planned. This hadn't been a moment of weakness, or a single bad decision made under financial pressure. This had been built piece by careful piece over more than a year, by someone who had studied my own handwriting closely enough to forge it convincingly, who had rented private storage specifically to keep the evidence of her spending away from anywhere her husband might accidentally discover it. "I'm ready," I told Diane, setting the photocopy down carefully on her desk. "Whatever comes next, I'm ready for it." "There's one more decision I need you to make first," Diane said. "How you want Preston to learn the full truth. I can simply present this case file to him directly through counsel formally. Or if you'd prefer something considerably more direct, we could arrange for him to see it unfold in front of him, the way you already began at that dinner. Some clients in your position find real value in that second option. Not for drama's sake, but because watching someone lie in real time with proof already sitting in the room tends to end any lingering doubt far more completely than a folder of documents ever could on its own." I thought about Preston's face at the door after that Sunday dinner, the uncertain, dawning suspicion I'd watched cross his features for the first time in longer than I could remember. I thought about how thoroughly he still seemed to trust his own wife, even after everything. "I want him to see it happen," I told Diane. All of it laid out clearly with no room left for another clever explanation. "I think that's the only way he's going to fully believe it." I called Preston myself to arrange the final dinner, and I chose my words carefully, framing the evening in a way I knew would feel entirely natural to him rather than anything he'd approach with his guard raised. "I've been thinking about setting up a small memorial fund in your father's name," I told him, which was true, something I had genuinely been considering for years without ever quite following through on it. "I'd like to talk it over with you and Renata, and I've asked Pastor Whitfield to join us too, since the church would likely administer it. Perhaps that Thursday." Preston agreed readily, and I could hear, even through the phone, a certain relief in his voice, the relief of a son who wanted very badly to believe that whatever tension had settled over our last dinner together might simply resolve itself into something as ordinary and comfortable as planning a charitable gift. I asked Walter to arrive separately, 20 minutes after everyone else had settled at the table. Timing I'd worked out carefully with Diane over the preceding days to ensure the evening unfolded exactly as we intended. Pastor Whitfield arrived first, warm and unhurried as always, genuinely pleased at the prospect of discussing a memorial fund, entirely unaware of the fuller purpose his presence actually served that evening. A witness, respected and impartial, whose simple presence at the table would make it considerably harder for Renata to dismiss whatever followed as some kind of private family misunderstanding. Preston and Renata arrived shortly after. Renata dressed carefully, composed in a way that suggested she'd decided, in the days since our last uncomfortable dinner, that whatever suspicion had briefly surfaced had likely passed. We ate for perhaps 20 minutes, talking pleasantly about the memorial fund, about Harold, about the church's various outreach programs Pastor Whitfield described with obvious enthusiasm. I watched Renata relax steadily over that stretch of conversation, her shoulders easing, her laughter growing more genuine, and I felt, watching her settle so comfortably into believing this evening posed no danger to her at all, a particular cold clarity settle over my own resolve. It was nearly 6:30, precisely the moment I'd arranged with Walter, when I set my fork down and reached beneath my chair for the folder I'd kept there, unnoticed since before anyone had arrived. "Before we finalize anything about the fund," I said, my voice calm and level, "I'd like to clear up something that's been troubling me. Renata, I want to give you every opportunity to explain this properly, in front of Pastor Whitfield before we go any further." I opened the folder and laid the bank statements out on the table, one by one, 12 months of clear, documented zeros where a $3,200 monthly transfer should have appeared. Renata's smile faltered just slightly, and beside her, I watched Preston's own expression shift into something tighter and more alert. "Mom, we already went through this," Preston said, though his voice carried none of the easy confidence it had a few weeks earlier. Renata explained there was a bank error. I looked into that explanation very carefully. I said, still calm, still deliberate. "I'd like to show you what I found instead." The front door opened at exactly that moment, right on schedule, and Walter Denny walked into my dining room carrying a folder of his own, considerably thicker than mine. Renata's face went pale the instant she recognized him. "Mr. Denny," she said, her voice suddenly tight. "What is this? Why are you here?" "Mrs. Marsh asked me to help her understand some discrepancies in the company's financial records," Walter said evenly, setting his own folder down on the table beside mine. "Preston, I think it's time you saw all of this properly together rather than in pieces." What followed unfolded with a particular terrible clarity I still find difficult to fully describe even now. Walter laid out the corporate card statements, the storage unit records, and finally the photocopied signature card bearing the forged version of my own name. Preston went through each document slowly, his hands beginning to shake somewhere around the third page, his face draining of color as the full shape of what he was looking at finally, completely assembled itself in front of him. "This is my mother's forged signature," he said quietly, holding the photocopy up, looking directly at his wife for the first time since Walter had entered the room. "Renata, tell me this isn't what it looks like." "Preston, I can explain everything," Renata said, her composure finally completely cracking, her voice rising into something desperate now rather than smoothly reassuring. "It wasn't like this looks. I was going to pay it all back, I swear. I just needed some breathing room. The business expenses got out of hand and I panicked, and I thought I'd have it sorted before anyone ever noticed." "You forged my mother's signature," Preston said, his voice barely above a whisper now, the particular quiet of a man whose entire understanding of his own life had just fractured completely in front of him. "You let her go a full year believing I'd abandoned her financially. She was eating from a food pantry, Renata. My mother was living on canned vegetables from a church pantry while you were spending $46,000 on handbags and spa visits and a car you told me was a gift. I never meant for it to go that far, Renata said, standing now, her chair scraping back hard against the floor. I was going to fix it, Preston, I promise you, I just needed time. You had 14 months, Walter said quietly, and something in his flat, professional tone landed harder in that moment than any raised voice could have. That's not a woman looking for breathing room. That's a sustained, deliberate pattern. Pastor Whitfield, silent throughout the entire confrontation, finally spoke, his voice gentle but carrying an unmistakable gravity. Renata, I think whatever comes next in this family, you need to leave this house tonight and let Preston and his mother sit with this properly without anyone else in the room. Renata looked around the table once at Preston's stricken, furious face, at my own steady, unflinching gaze, at Walter's folder still sitting open between us, and I watched something in her finally, completely give way. She grabbed her purse from the back of her chair and left without another word, the front door slamming hard behind her, the sound of her car pulling out of my driveway entirely too fast just a moment later. Preston sat very still at my table for a long while after she'd gone, staring down at the forged signature card still in his hands. And when he finally looked up at me, his eyes were wet with tears I hadn't seen from him since his father's funeral. Mom, he said, I am so sorry. I had no idea. I should have known. I should have visited more, I should have checked, I should have. You believed your wife, I told him gently, reaching across the table to take his hand the way I hadn't in longer than I could remember. That's not a failure of love, Preston. That's simply what trust looks like, right up until someone decides to abuse it. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late autumn, nearly 3 months after that final dinner at my own table. The intervening weeks filled with the particular slow, careful machinery of the legal system moving forward at its own unhurried pace, regardless of how urgently I sometimes wished it might move faster. Diane had prepared me thoroughly for what to expect, walking me through the courtroom itself the week before so the space wouldn't feel entirely foreign when the actual proceeding began, explaining patiently the difference between what this preliminary hearing would accomplish and the fuller trial that might follow if Renata's attorney chose to contest the charges rather than negotiate a settlement. Given the strength of what we have, Diane told me the morning before, I'd be surprised if this goes to a full trial at all. The forensic handwriting analysis on the signature card is essentially unchallengeable. The corporate card records are unambiguous. And Mrs. Marsh, I want you to understand something important about your own contribution to this case, because I don't think you've fully appreciated it yet. Your ledger, the one you started keeping that first morning after Mother's Day, has turned out to be one of the most compelling pieces of evidence in this entire file. Judges see financial records constantly. They rarely see a victim's own contemporaneous, dated documentation of exactly when suspicion first arose and how it developed methodically over time. It tells a story numbers alone can't tell. The courtroom itself was smaller than I'd expected, wood-paneled and quiet, considerably less dramatic than anything I'd half imagined from the courtroom scenes I'd occasionally watched on television over the years. I sat beside Diane at a long table, my leather ledger resting in front of me alongside the folder of bank statements, and I felt, waiting for the proceeding to begin, a strange calm settle over me that surprised me more than the nervousness I'd expected to feel instead. Renata sat across the room with her own attorney, a sharp-suited younger man who kept leaning over to murmur something in her ear every few minutes, and I noticed, watching her, how considerably diminished she looked compared to the polished, confident woman who'd once handed me a scented candle with such warm, practiced generosity. Preston sat in the gallery behind me, not beside his wife, a small but significant detail I understood carried its own quiet weight in that room. Diane presented our case methodically, walking the judge, a measured, unhurried woman named Judge Alvarado, who I understood from Diane's earlier explanation had handled a considerable number of elder exploitation cases over her years on the bench, through the full timeline of evidence. The forged signature card, confirmed by forensic analysis to be a deliberate, practiced approximation of my own handwriting rather than any accident of similar names. The fraudulent account, opened 14 months earlier, receiving every single one of the 12 monthly transfers meant for my support. The corporate card records, spanning 18 months, totaling $45,800 in charges bearing no legitimate connection to Hayes Technology Solutions business operations. The storage unit rented the same month the fraudulent account was opened, containing evidence Renata had apparently taken considerable care to keep hidden from her own husband. And then, near the end of her presentation, Diane turned to my ledger itself, entering it into evidence and reading carefully several entries aloud to the court. The dated notation from the morning after Mother's Day, when I'd first confirmed the empty bank statements. The entry describing the Range Rover and the $200 offered so casually in an envelope. The careful, dated record of that final dinner where Renata had first claimed a transfer had gone through on the 21st. A date my own bank statements definitively contradicted. Your Honor, Diane said, what this ledger demonstrates is not simply the scope of the fraud itself, which the financial records establish clearly on their own. It demonstrates the deliberate, sustained pattern of gaslighting my client endured throughout this period, being told repeatedly by the very person exploiting her that she was simply confused, forgetful, unable to properly track her own affairs. Mrs. Marsh spent 40 years as a professional accountant. Her memory and her attention to financial detail have never once been the problem in this situation. Renata's attorney offered what defense he could, arguing for leniency given his client's cooperation once confronted, suggesting the funds had been intended as a loan against future repayment rather than outright theft, a characterization Judge Alvarado received, I noticed, with visible skepticism. Counsel, the judge said, a 14-month pattern involving a forged legal document, a fraudulent account opened under a deliberately similar name, and nearly $46,000 in undisclosed personal spending charged to a corporate account does not resemble a loan arrangement, however your client might characterize it after the fact. I'm not inclined to view this as a simple lapse in judgment. The ruling, when it came, arrived with the same measured, unhurried clarity Judge Alvarado had carried throughout the entire proceeding. Full restitution of the $38,400 diverted from my support payments, to be repaid according to a court-supervised schedule. A separate finding requiring restitution of the $45,800 in unauthorized corporate charges, owed jointly to Hayes Technology Solutions. Renata was stripped of any authorized access to Preston's personal or corporate accounts, effective immediately, and the court referred the forged signature cards separately to the district attorney's office for consideration of criminal forgery charges, a process Diane explained would likely unfold over the following months, entirely apart from the civil restitution already ordered. I didn't feel triumphant sitting in that courtroom listening to the ruling read aloud. I felt more than anything a tired, settled relief. The particular relief of watching a system finally, properly acknowledge something I had spent an entire year quietly enduring without any language to name it clearly. Preston found me in the hallway afterward, his face still carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent 3 months watching his own marriage dismantle itself piece by documented piece. It's over, he said quietly. Or at least this part is. This part is over, I agreed. I don't know yet what comes after it, for you especially. He nodded slowly and I watched him glance back toward the courtroom doors, where Renata had just emerged with her attorney, her face pale and drawn, refusing to meet either of our eyes as she walked quickly past us toward the exit. I don't think there's much of a marriage left to salvage, Preston said quietly. I don't think I want there to be, honestly, not after everything. But Mom, I don't know how to begin fixing what I let happen to you either. You start, I told him, by simply showing up. Consistently. That's all any of this was ever really about. I want to tell you that the courtroom victory marked the end of the hardest part, but I've learned enough about how these things actually unfold to know that the reckoning rarely arrives all at once, in one tidy afternoon. What came next over the following 4 months tested both Preston and me in ways I hadn't fully anticipated, even after everything that had already happened. Renata contested the restitution schedule initially, through her attorney, requesting an extended timeline she claimed her current finances couldn't accommodate. What emerged during that process, uncovered through the routine financial disclosures the court required of her, was something neither Preston nor I had anticipated. In the 6 weeks between that final dinner at my table and the preliminary hearing, while the case was still working its way through the early stages of the legal process, Renata had systematically withdrawn what remained of the couple's joint personal savings, nearly $90,000 accumulated over the course of their marriage, transferring it into accounts under her sole name before the court could freeze anything further. Preston learned about it the same week the court ordered restitution, sitting across from me at my own kitchen table, his face carrying an exhaustion I hadn't seen on him since the week his father died. "She took everything, Mom," he said quietly. "Not just what she stole from you. Our savings, the money we'd set aside for the house renovation, all of it. She's gone. She filed for divorce yesterday through her lawyer. I didn't even get a phone call." I sat with him for a long while that afternoon, saying very little, understanding that some griefs don't benefit from being talked through too quickly. Preston had built a successful company, and by any outward measure he remained, even then, a man of considerable means. But I watched something in him that autumn that went beyond simple financial loss. A genuine, humbling reckoning with exactly how completely he had trusted the wrong person, and exactly how much that misplaced trust had cost the one person who'd never once stopped loving him honestly. He came to my house on a Thursday evening in November, during the kind of storm Oklahoma produces without much warning that time of year, rain coming down hard enough that his coat was soaked through by the time I got the door open. He stood on my porch for a moment before coming inside, and I understood, looking at his face in that particular light, that he hadn't simply come to escape the weather. "I don't know how to fix any of this," he said, sitting at my kitchen table with a towel I'd handed him still draped over his shoulders. "The company's fine financially. I'll rebuild the savings eventually. But Mom, I keep thinking about you eating out of a food pantry for a year while I believed I was taking care of you. I don't know how you're supposed to just forgive something like that. I'm not sure forgiveness is something you're supposed to arrive at all at once," I told him, pouring us both tea the way I had 1,000 times over his lifetime. "I think it's something you build the same way trust gets built in the first place. Slowly. Consistently. One honest visit at a time." "I'd like to try," he said, "if you'll let me." I did let him, and over the following months, Preston did exactly what I'd asked of him that day outside the courtroom. He simply showed up consistently without needing to be reminded or invited, rebuilding something between us that felt, by the following spring, considerably more honest than whatever comfortable distant arrangement we'd settled into during the years before any of this began. It was Preston himself that spring who first raised the idea that eventually became the Ledger and Grace Foundation. "You caught this because you knew what to look for, Mom," he said one evening, sitting at my kitchen table reviewing some paperwork together. A habit we'd fallen into that felt, to both of us, like its own quiet form of healing. "Most people in your position wouldn't have known how to check. Wouldn't have had the accounting background or the confidence or even known where to start. What if we built something that helped people who don't have 40 years of bookkeeping experience do exactly what you did?" We established the foundation together that summer, funded initially by a portion of Preston's own recovered savings once the restitution finally cleared, and later by donations that grew steadily once local news outlets picked up our story, drawn to the particular satisfying shape of an elderly widow catching sophisticated fraud through nothing more than patient documentation and 40 years of professional instinct. The foundation offered exactly what I imagine might have helped me most, that first confused morning after Mother's Day. A hotline staffed by retired accountants and financial counselors, free legal consultations for elderly Oklahomans who suspected exploitation but didn't know how to begin proving it, and a simple, plain language guide to exactly the kind of documentation I'd instinctively fallen back on. The leather ledger method I'd used my whole professional life, now written up as a step-by-step tool anyone could follow. I was named Oklahoma's Woman of the Year the following spring, an honor that still, if I'm honest, sits a little strangely with me, given that everything the award recognized began with a betrayal I never asked for and wouldn't have chosen. I accepted it anyway, standing at a podium in Oklahoma City with Preston in the audience, because I understood by then that the honor wasn't really about me at all. It was about every quiet, elderly person out there rationing their own dignity in silence, certain no one would believe them over a polished, confident liar, who might now know there was another way through it. I still keep that leather ledger, the one I opened for the first time at my own kitchen table the morning after Mother's Day, sitting on a shelf in my study rather than tucked away in a closet box. I look at it sometimes on quiet evenings, and I think about the woman I was that year, rationing canned vegetables and telling neighbors I simply preferred a modest life, too proud or too frightened to admit how badly things had actually gotten. I learned that dignity was never something anyone else had the right to take from me simply because I was old or quiet or trusting. What I gained in the end wasn't only the money that was rightfully mine, or even my son's genuine rebuilt presence in my life, though both mattered to me more than I can properly express. It was the certainty finally that patience and precision, the same quiet tools I'd spent 40 years honing at a desk nobody paid much attention to, were never small things at all. They were, when it finally mattered most, exactly enough to save myself.